Good morning. Well, let me add my welcome to West Michigan. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful weather. We have 3 days like this a year, so you've come at just the right time. I'm also glad some of you made it over to Hope College. How many of you went on the run this morning, or at least went over to Hope? Great. I hope you enjoyed seeing our college. We're a very different place from Grand Valley, but actually have a wonderful relationship with them. We partner on a lot of projects, and Grand Valley has been one of the great success stories in higher education over the last couple of decades, literally growing out of a cornfield right here into a really nationally prominent and very high quality university. So we are proud to have them as a neighbor and a partner right here in West Michigan. I want to just share a few thoughts with you about leadership this morning, and I want to do it sort of in the context of why it is that it's harder to be a leader today. I want to suggest that it's actually getting harder, and I want to think that that might be a theme that we'll return to throughout this conference. I think even as we speak later on today in a presidential panel in the afternoon, that's likely to be a theme that some of us want to talk with you about again, because I do think that the times are not as easy for leaders as they were at one time. I want to explain why I think that's true and what I think some of the competencies are that are important for us as leaders today. You know, if you think back going over 100 years ago when people founded ODK, and I've been proud to be a part of ODK and to be the faculty advisor at Samford University when I was there, one of the things that I've really come to understand in studying leadership and in really trying to think more critically about leadership is that I think for a long time it was a minority of people like those visionaries that founded ODK, who had an understanding that leadership is actually something that we have to work on and hone and develop. I remember a few years ago, about 15 years ago now, I had the opportunity to sit down and interview the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the world as part of a book that I was working on at the time. And as we sat down and began to talk about leadership, I asked the question that we often ask when we talk about leadership, which is, are leaders born or made? And without hesitating, he said, they're born. He said, you've either got it or you don't. Our job in the corporation is to figure out who's got it and give them leadership responsibility. And as we went on in the conversation, it was not surprising then to learn that this was a company that did not have a leadership identification and development program of any kind, because after all, how do you go about developing leaders if they've either got it or they don't? Well, it's probably not surprising in hindsight that it wasn't too many years after that that he was removed from his position, actually because of some short-sighted decisions that he had made, some decisions that privileged the very high-level officers of the company at a time that other employees of the company were experiencing some significant cutbacks in compensation. There were some layoffs. And that wasn't affecting senior leaders who were actually continuing to do quite well. And that was very costly to him as a leader. So I just want to suggest that I think we know, and ODK has known for a long time, that leadership, in fact, is developmental, that none of us are born leaders. And I think what we're learning from research over time, as leadership actually is developing as an academic discipline the last 30 years or so, we're learning that leadership is actually something that can be developed with almost anyone. In other words, it's not that there's a certain set of inborn leadership traits that are necessary for someone to be an effective leader, that actually people who come from very different kinds of sort of DNA makeup, if you will, have the potential to lead well if they just simply develop the competencies to do so and practice them. You see recently, for example, a whole spate of books in the last 5 years or so about introverts and ways that introverts can be effective leaders. I think there was a time when leadership was always sort of thought of as synonymous with being outgoing, kind of a people person, having good people skills. Well, it turns out that people who have different traits can actually become good leaders. So with that in mind, with the idea that leadership is in fact developmental and that it's something that we actually have to work to develop, it doesn't just happen by accident. Holding a leadership position doesn't always make you a better leader. You actually have to work at becoming a better leader. I want to share with you some of the challenges that I think all of us today in various capacities of leadership are faced with, and why I think it's more important than ever to be devoted to our own development and to the development of leaders in the organizations and institutions that we're all a part of. My guess is that many, if not most, of your own academic institutions, if you read your mission statement or a vision statement, somewhere in that language you'll find the word leadership, that it's kind of assumed that institutions of higher learning are developing leaders. At Hope College, we talk about developing, educating students for lives of leadership and service. And so that begs the question, exactly what are we doing to be intentional about ensuring that leadership is actually being developed, that those competencies, capacities are actually being developed, that we don't just assume that being a well-educated person means that you're also a capable leader. These are things I just think we need to be all conscious of and thinking about in today's world. So how is it that leadership is becoming more difficult? Well, I think there are some indications of how that may be, and one is that over the last 50 years or so, we have seen in the United States, and now more recently in research that's been developed worldwide, a precipitous and continuous decline in the trust that people place in leaders of institutions and organizations. In fact, in our country, the Gallup organization would tell us that trust of institutions and the people who lead them peaked sometime around the Kennedy assassination and has been in more or less steady decline ever since, with some ups and downs along the way based on sort of larger externalities. But by and large, people are less and less likely to extend trust to leaders in a kind of unquestioning way. World Economic Forum has done some major research in recent years internationally, and they have found that this trend is also true across cultures around the world. In countries worldwide, they've found that I think maybe 60 different countries, many different cultures, that as they have tracked the attitudes of citizens toward people who lead institutions, that is government, business, healthcare, religious organizations, other important pillar institutions in society, that people are less and less prone to trust those leaders. Now, there's a lot of research that's developed among scholars about why might that be? What could it be that's causing people to have less trust in leaders? Well, I think one way to think about that is we might begin by asking ourselves, how do we define trust? What do we mean by trust? Well, one way of thinking about trust is that trust is the benefit of the doubt. It's the fact that sometimes when we are in leadership roles, whatever those roles may be, we actually make mistakes, or we are perceived to make mistakes. And when those times happen, we want to be given the benefit of the doubt. We want people to give us an opportunity to explain ourselves, to answer questions, to correct the record, to make sure the facts are there. We're finding that that is less and less the case, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. Another way to think about trust is that trust is a bet that people are placing that a person in a role or a position of leadership will act in a way that brings about good outcomes for themselves. If you think about trusting someone, if I trust you, it means that I'm making some assumptions about your future actions, that you'll act in a manner that will actually validate the trust that I've extended to you, and that means that the outcomes of your leadership, of the decisions you make, the ways you conduct yourself, will be good, in my view. World Economic Forum, when asking the question about leaders, simply asks, do you believe or have confidence in this leader, whatever that leader they're asking about may be, and they'll break it down by many different categories, can be trusted to act in the best interest of you and your family. Okay, so if we trust people in leadership positions, we believe that they have our own interest at heart, that what they do will actually serve us well in some way. Certainly that they won't violate the trust that we've placed in them in a way that might bring harm to us. And so those are ways of thinking about leadership. It's a reciprocal relationship. It requires others to make some assumptions, some decisions about those of us who are in leadership positions and actually need that trust in order to be able to function well in the roles that we occupy. The economist, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, has said that trust is like oxygen. We only notice when it seems to be in short supply. Well, I think today we all sense that there's a little less air in the room, a little less oxygen to breathe if we're in roles of leadership. I think leaders experience that sense of sort of feeling suffocated by not having enough freedom, enough sort of air to breathe in order to lead well. And let me say just a word about the form that takes, because I think it's actually a way of understanding the challenge of leadership and why it's getting more difficult, particularly when we talk about leadership of larger and more complex institutions and organizations and causes, where leaders are responsible for more diverse and more of a multiplicity of interests, often competing interests. One thing that we know as we kind of research what are the reasons for this trust deficit that's been documented so well is that people have concluded, researchers have concluded, that one thing that seems to be eroding trust is our constant and relentless flow of information that we're all subjected to day and night. We are inundated with information. It seems to be a limitless amount of information, and it's being pushed toward us all the time. And if you imagine what the effect of some of that information is, well, I'll put it this way. When I was young, back before many of you were born, way before some of you were born, as a kid growing up, you know, and even in my college days, our access to news was limited to 30 minutes of nightly news on one of 3 networks. You got just a smidgen of international news in that, maybe if you were lucky. The morning newspaper with your coffee, and that was about it. Today, think about how we're in this world where news and information about what's happening is constantly being made available to us 24/7. Many of us through a smartphone probably have news feeds that we kind of track and keep up with. I do as well. Well, one suggestion that's been made is that in a world where we're subjected to that kind of constant flow of information, much of it is unsettling. Much of it causes us to feel uncomfortable. And much of the news that we get about institutions and about people in leadership is negative. It's individuals in positions of responsibility being questioned, mistakes that have been made, violations of the trust that we've placed in people seem to be writ large, and we seem to be reminded of it constantly with this kind of barrage of information that we receive all the time about people in leadership. And I think that's important, because whether that information is about you as a leader or not, it does plant, I think, in people's minds a sense of doubt about whether you can really extend that kind of trust to someone in leadership and give them the benefit of the doubt that they need in order to lead well. Another thing that's related to this that I think is contributing to the challenge of leadership is the constant demands that our information society places on each one of us, every one of you and every one of us in leadership roles, to be responsive continuously to the interests and expectations of everybody around us. You know, while I'm here, there will be 40 new emails this morning, I'm sure, maybe more. It is a Saturday. But every one of those will demand a response. And it's likely that during the day, I, like you, will be getting text messages from people at the college who need me to respond to things and have questions or concerns or want to bring something to my attention. Think about social media and the way social media is constantly calling to you to be responsive to somebody else in real time. It's not that we have the luxury of a lot of time to sort of think about things. We have to respond to this in order to get to that. We can't wait. We've got to stay on top of it. And this kind of relentless and continuous demand for our attention individually, I think actually makes it more challenging for us as leaders to give our attention, to give our full attention to the things that sometimes require reflection and thought and really careful consideration and even real conversation with other people, outside of this thing that we hold in the palm of our hand. It's a real different kind of experience for leaders today. And then I think the fact that all of this, along with a continuously globalizing and mobilizing society, is causing for many leaders a greater sense of what the leadership theorist Howard Gardner calls complexification. He talks about how everything that we do feels more complex. And that complexification means that it's harder for us to get focused and to get clarity and to come to conclusions that we have confidence in, because everything seems to be more complex than we thought it was at first glance. Think about right here in this part of the world, in West Michigan, where we live. I frequently tell our students that if you never leave West Michigan, if you go to college here and you stay here, you will encounter more people from more cultures, places of origin, ethnicities, races, backgrounds, languages, religions, than your parents and grandparents could ever have imagined, because that kind of complexity is coming to us. We are living in an increasingly diverse world and in a mobile society where people are moving around as much as they are. Whether we're moving around ourselves or not, we're encountering more people who have differing interests and backgrounds and assumptions and ways of thinking than perhaps we have assumed in the way that we've interacted with those closest to us for much of our lives. All of this requires an intentionality about developing our own competencies and our own abilities to lead well. It also has amounted to what I've come to term in some of the writing I've done, a climate of hyper-accountability. When people don't trust you and they don't give you that benefit of the doubt, there is more of a demand for you to justify yourself and explain what you're doing. We are in a world now where there is more of a demand than ever for leaders to be transparent. Provide more information. Explain why you made the decision you made. Give me the data. I'm not going to just assume that I can trust that you made the right decision. You need to prove it to me. This is true of us in higher education. It's true of leaders in business, in social services. It's true of people in healthcare, in the government. This constant demand for accountability and greater justification of our actions is a new kind of tenor in the world of leadership, and it's something that I think many of us are finding requires us to not just be responsive in being accountable, but to anticipate the kinds of accountability that will be expected of us, and to be more proactively transparent and disclosive in explaining what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how the decisions are made that we've made, so that we might forestall the questioning or preempt the questioning that inevitably comes. But that's a kind of competency. It requires us as leaders to begin to think more proactively about the need to explain what we're doing and to provide information proactively and continuously to those that we lead and who are affected by our actions as leaders. It also requires, I think, more of a commitment to being collaborative in the way that we lead, in recognizing that in today's world, that constant communication that surrounds us is actually an invitation to be engaged with others in a way that actually requires us as leaders to ask questions, get input, seek expertise and advice as we make the decisions that we make. I think the days of the kind of all-knowing leader, the great leader who has all the answers, who can simply be entrusted with making good decisions because this person actually has so much of it together that they don't really need the rest of us, those days are gone. And I think all of us in leadership positions know that the more we collaborate, the more we consult, the more we listen and involve others, the more likely we are to make good decisions in a world of greater complexity, and the more likely it is that we'll engender trust with those that depend upon us and work with us, because they'll know how the decisions were made and that their input was heard and they were part of it. Again, not something that maybe was assumed in years past, but I think is more assumed today than ever. So if you think about how some of the challenges of leadership are changing, these are really requiring new attitudes, new perspectives for those of us in roles of leadership. It's not enough to simply be competent at making good decisions on our own. We have to make good decisions in the company of others and with the involvement of others, and we have to be willing and able to explain that in ways that satisfy those who are going to want more accountability and more information about how we are leading and why we're acting in the ways that we are. Very interesting kind of new paradigm for leadership as I see it, and something that actually adds to the workload of leaders. All the things that I'm describing here require extra effort. It's all above and beyond what you have to do to get through the day getting your work done in whatever role you're in. It takes extra time to be transparent and disclose and explain. It takes extra time to involve more people and be collaborative in the decisions that we're making. that's one reason it doesn't happen as often as it should, because it's a lot of work and a lot of extra effort to maintain that kind of engagement with others that's so much important in a world where we have to work very hard at securing and maintaining the trust that we need to lead. I would say that I was asked to speak today about, or with the idea of scholarship in mind. You know, one of the values of ODK is scholarship, and we think about what is it that we need to learn? What do we need to know in order to be good leaders? Where does scholarship come into play? Well, some of these developmental competencies I'm describing certainly require study and development and scholarship. I also think that in many organizations today, because of the complexity of the world that we lead in, it's more important than ever to have enough of an understanding as educated people of where the expertise lies with others who can help round out the conversation. I've come to refer to this as learning how to think in the round, understanding that when we face complex decisions, difficult problems and challenges, it's important to be able to surround the problem with the perspectives of multiple people who bring different expertise and perspectives to the problem in order to see it fully. Most of us, in looking at a problem, whatever our expertise may be individually, can only see certain facets of a problem. We actually require other people to join us in surrounding the problem to see the other facets that make the problem as complex as it is, and ultimately to understand the nature of the problem and to find a solution to it that's satisfactory. So an example that I just wanted to share with you, and I think this is something that you can make up many of your own examples very quickly as you think about this, is the crisis in Flint, Michigan. Since we're in Michigan and your theme has to do with Great Lakes and water, I thought it might be interesting just to reflect very briefly on a crisis that has affected people in this state in the last year in particular, really the last 2 years, and that has to do with the quality of water in the city of Flint, Michigan. Flint is a city of close to 100,000 people. It's a city that used to be in the early 1960s about 200,000, but it's been in decline. And it's suffered economically as the auto production industry has moved away from the city. Some of the sources of economic drivers have dwindled over the years. And today in Michigan, in Flint, Michigan, you have about 40% of the population living below the poverty level. The second poorest large city in America, if you can imagine that. Youngstown, Ohio is number one. You have a population that is very diverse. Along with the poverty level, you have a large minority population, principally African Americans, who came to work in the auto industry and actually migrated to Flint, Michigan years ago, maybe even 2 generations ago, to find jobs. About 57% of the population are African Americans. You find some significant religious diversity there as well. Michigan is a state that's attracted a number of Arab Muslims, and while most of those people live in Dearborn, you'll find in Michigan that in Flint that there's a significant population as well. So you have a diverse population. You have people who have great need and have less education and are more economically dependent on support from the state. And you have a floundering economy where in trying to deal with some of the cost issues facing a city that was in receivership, city officials began to look for a way to find a new source of water for the city. Well, I won't get into the details of the case other than to say that the city decided that it would be good to find a new source of water coming from Lake Huron, one of the Great Lakes, that they would build a system that would bring that water in. It became very political. There was a lot of political infighting within the state, particularly with the Detroit water folks over there. And in the long run, the city of Flint, with the environmental authorities in the state of Michigan, made a decision that they would draw water from the Flint River. Well, the Flint River is not a suitable source of drinking water. It's a river that's been heavily polluted for years by industry, and drawing water from the Flint River would require a great deal of purification effort to clean that water in order to use it. Long story short, when that decision was made for economic reasons, not a lot of thought was given to the extent to which that water was contaminated. It became the drinking water of the community. The challenge then became that the water was contaminated with chemicals that actually caused lead in lead pipes to leach into the water. Old pipes from the early 20th century built to go to homes and businesses were made of lead. And that's not so bad if you treat the water properly. But if you don't, chemicals in the water can actually cause that lead to leach into the water and can put the lead into drinking water, which of course lead in water causes tremendous health risk, especially for children. And so in Flint, as people began to express concern about the quality of the water, began to worry about what it seemed to be health effects on children and raise concerns about it. One of the problems was you had a community of people who were affected by this, who didn't have very much political clout, who did not have a lot of voice in raising concerns about what was affecting their own families and their community, and they were wholly dependent on leaders in their own city and in the state to address the problem. The problem went on longer than it should have. Those residents really weren't heard. Finally, when tests were conducted and it was recognized that there was a serious risk to public health in the city of Flint, a lot of damage had been done, and it's a complex problem to solve. The problem is not solved yet, although things are being done to do so. A lot of money is being poured into there from state and federal government, but they have a ways to go before they really can turn things around. In the process, a complete loss of confidence in leaders by people in Flint, and perhaps many people in the state of Michigan, has resulted. The governor has certainly taken a pounding in this as the leader of our state government, and one who people said should have been more responsive to the concerns of people in the community about the quality of their water. There are actually officials at the state and local level who are now facing criminal charges. A number of people in state and local agencies have lost their jobs. Confidence in public leadership is probably at an all-time low in Flint, Michigan. And so how do we understand a problem like that? Well, we were thinking about it at Hope College and wondering how can we really begin to understand the nature of the problem, how it developed, and what it would take to solve the problem with water in the city of Flint. And we put together a program to study that really demonstrated this concept that I've suggested to you of thinking in the round. The idea that that problem in Flint is actually more complicated than we might think at first glance. We might just say it's a public policy issue, let's just make the right decisions by the government, and we can get this solved. We can put some money into it and hire people and fix the water system. Well, we brought together scholars on our campus, members of our faculty, and we asked them in advance to study the situation in Flint and to think about what their own discipline might yield in the way of additional perspective on the problem in Flint. I think that the conversation that resulted from that among scholars on our campus was actually a really good example of how thinking in the round helps any of us as leaders to be better versed and more fluent in understanding the nature of problems that we're faced with. So in this case, we invited faculty members from our chemistry department. Think about the chemistry of the water. Important issue there. And we have people who specialize in water. Biology, think about the health effects, the biological effects of those chemicals on individuals. People who are in the health professions, nursing, for example, who understand the nature of some of the illnesses that are waterborne and caused by the contaminants in the water. Geologists who understand water and sources of water and how to find sources that are more pure and suitable for drinking, and how we go about finding those sources that are reliable and sustainable. Environmental science, understanding how the river got polluted in the first place and what one needs to do to think about the implications of living with an environmentally contaminated river that runs right through the middle of your city and is an important source of water for irrigation, drinking, and other uses. Political science, trying to understand how the political problem developed in the way that it did, that public officials seemed to not be responsive soon enough and effectively enough to a problem that ultimately rose to crisis proportions. And then what are the political effects longer term in the sense of how does this affect the interaction of citizens with their elected leaders as we go forward, given the loss of trust and confidence that's resulted from this failure. History, understanding that in Flint, you can't understand the community without understanding its history and how it came to be a place where over time so much poverty has developed, and there's been so much of an economic crisis in the community. And of course, economics. Professors of economics helping us understand some of the cost and economic impact of the decisions that needed to be made in order to get clean water. Sociologists helping us with thinking about the ways that communities that are in low wealth neighborhoods often interact with or don't interact with those who lead them, and how communities that have very little voice organize and can be heard. We invited our psychologists to the conversation as well to think about social psychology in the midst of a crisis. We had faculty members who were scholars in the arts get involved in this as well. You wouldn't think the arts would have a lot to do with it, but actually through poetry, and in Flint there is a great tradition of poetry from people who are at the margins, who express the needs and the challenges that people in that community face in ways that sometimes we can only hear through poetry. Art, looking at how art actually can be used to call attention to issues and to bring voice to those who need voice. Our philosophy professors were unpacking the ethical issues involved in this situation. We had engineering faculty in thinking about some of the challenges of creating a new water system and how we go about piping water to a water treatment plant and what's involved in actually treating that water from a process standpoint. And so you can get the idea that in order to really understand the nature of the problem that we're dealing with in Flint, Michigan, we need to bring a lot of perspectives. We need to think in the round. We need to be able to unpack that problem using the expertise of a number of different people who actually can help us better understand it. If you imagine yourself as the mayor of Flint, the governor of the state, the head of the water department, the head of the state environmental quality agency, someone from the EPA, others who are looking at the problem, I would argue that it's necessary to be a collaborative leader who's able to bring to bear on the problem this range of viewpoints. And what I would say about that is it's not important for us as educated people to be fluent in every discipline. I don't think any one of us can. We can't possibly understand all of this individually. But to be conversational enough in various fields, various disciplines, as educated people, so that we recognize that when we're leading, we need perspectives of people who have expertise different from our own and life experiences different from our own, who can come and shed light on decisions that we're making in a way that help us think more holistically and more effectively about the problems that we face. And so I believe that for today's leaders, these competencies, and I'll just end with this, of recognizing that our challenge of building and sustaining trust, which is ultimately the only thing that it's the common denominator of the success of every leader. People have to trust you. In order to do that, we've got to learn to engage people more transparently, more collaboratively, to recognize the limits of our own expertise, and to invite perspectives and expertise from those who can round out our own expertise as leaders so that we can solve problems and make decisions that are more reliable and more effective for all of those who have entrusted us with leadership. So I'm going to stop with that, and if we have a minute, I'll be glad to take a question or two. Are there any questions? Yes.
Earlier you talked about trust and leadership and kind of expounded on social media and plus media and how we're getting a lot of news around us and a lot of bad news. So do you think some of the erosion of trust and leadership is a result of media becoming a sense? We see so much bad news and we're so used to being filled up really loud, and how we're all over that when we see the failure, we take that very well.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. The idea that the news that we get, the information that we get, is very often negative. when it comes to leaders. What we hear about our leaders is not as much the good news. I don't think people focus on that, whether it's social media, bloggers, whether it's news coverage. It's the failures that get attention. It's the questions that are a little more provocative and sensational that often sort of get our attention. And so all the people that are good leaders, and the world is full of good leaders, are often not the ones that we hear about. And so it can lead to a kind of cynicism or a sense of defeatism, I think, when we imagine that there may be people in leadership that we can trust. We wonder, who are they? We don't hear much about them. It's a good question. Well, I think in leadership, good leadership, there's always been an element of compromise in the sense that you have to balance and weigh one interest against another. Every interest is likely to adopt a winner-take-all approach. I want to win. I want to get my way. And I think very often in leadership roles, it can't work that way. That's one of the benefits of this concept of thinking in the round. As we think in the round and we bring different interests to the table, people who have different perspectives and interests and needs, we recognize that as leaders, sometimes we have to work out an understanding that keeps some of those interests in tension rather than capitulates to the interests of one group or another at the expense of the other as well. So I think in today's society, there is often a very strident tone that's struck, especially it seems in some social media, where it's all about, I must win, and for me to win, you must lose, and for you to lose, I must silence you because your view isn't valid and shouldn't be heard. And I think for the most part, leaders have to resist that and insist that all views are heard and taken seriously to the extent that they can be, because I think that's the only way we can sustain communities of the type that most of us lead. You had a question.
Yeah, so I'm sorry for work. I know you speak a lot about how people like me have really enough to justify decisions for that kind of integrated leadership. Like I haven't had to be the end of the environment, then like this environment now, I haven't seen that issue. So I kind of see it as a sign of
No, I think you're right. I don't mean to suggest that demands for accountability are a bad thing. I actually think it's a good thing that people want to hold leaders accountable. But I do think that leaders are finding that this sense of hyper accountability, of constantly having to explain what you do, always being questioned, does have a very tiring effect on people. That it feels like no matter what you do, you have to explain it even more, which again means I think more of a burden on the leader to be more transparently proactive in communicating to people who are likely to want accountability and to ask questions. But that's a really good point. It's not a bad thing that people want leaders to be accountable, but it doesn't make leadership easier. I think it makes it harder. Thanks for us.